Thank you very much, Stephen, for that very warm introduction. Reminding me of all that writing made me feel tired already. Thank you, Stephen, for not only for the kind things you said, but also for the fact that you did allow yourself to be influenced by the argument of that book, Animal Liberation. And I think that's really important. And obviously, I wrote it because I hope people would be influenced by it. But it doesn't always happen. So I think all of those, you may not be the only one in the audience, all of those who are influenced by that argument, you should give yourself some credit that you had your mind open enough to listen to those arguments and think about them. And I want to also thank Jay for having put this event together. I know it takes a lot of organising to do conferences, so that's not an easy task. So we're standing today, I believe, at the beginning of a long struggle for greater rights for non-human animals, a struggle which has been going for some time, as Stephen suggested, but which still has a long way to go, and which we can hope that the lawsuit that Stephen has launched is a further significant step along that march. But I thought, since we are at the beginning of what we believe will be that long road, that it's appropriate to remember somebody else who walked a long road to freedom, died just yesterday, and that's Nelson Mandela. A couple of things that Nelson Mandela said are, I think, relevant for what we're talking about. Firstly, he said, what really counts in life is the difference you make for the lives of others. And I think that's something that we're also thinking about. We're, of course, thinking about the others as going, including human beings, but going beyond the boundary of our species. And there are many important and much neglected others whose lives we can and hope to make a difference to. The other thing that Nelson Mandela said in an interview when he was asked how he kept going in the face of the seemingly insuperable obstacles of being imprisoned on Robben Island in apartheid-dominated South Africa, is he said, I approach every problem with optimism. And I think that's really important too. We can easily get dispirited. People often say, how do you keep going when you see how animals are suffering and continuing to suffer? But we also have to remember that we have been making progress, that there is progress that's being made, and we have to be positive about the prospects of continuing to make that progress, and in fact making much more progress over the next, say, roughly 40 years that I've been involved in the animal movement, over the next 40 years to make much further progress still. Okay, so that's by way of preliminary. What I'm here to talk about is who is a person, and in particular, what is a non-speciesist answer to that question, who is a person? So, in order to do that, I first want to say something about what speciesism is and why we ought to reject speciesism. That may well be familiar territory to a lot of you. In fact, maybe pretty much everything that I'm going to say is going to be familiar territory to a lot of you. But I do need to say it for those who may not be so familiar, and to make the case that I'm trying to put together. So, speciesism is an attitude of bias or prejudice against beings on the grounds of their species alone. And this is something that obviously the term, which I did not invent, I got it from Richard Ryder, a British writer concerned with this issue, but I suppose I helped to popularise it and develop it, the concept philosophically. Obviously it's intended to make the analogy with racism and sexism. And in a similar way, it suggests that there's this prejudice or bias against beings who are not part of your own group, some group that is more powerful than others, and that can therefore act in ways that deny the interests of those outsiders. But because it's been so much part of human existence, it's sometimes hard for people to get to see what we're doing to other animals and the way we think about other animals as a bias at all. That seems to be something natural or many people justify. But I think it's worth looking briefly at some of the justifications that have been offered over the centuries, because then we can also see that they fail and that we have to think again. For example, if we go back to the beginnings of Western civilization, we find the roots of our philosophy in ancient Greece, particularly in the work of Aristotle, who was, more than any other Greek philosopher, incorporated into later Western Christian thinking in the Middle Ages by figures like Thomas Aquinas. So Aristotle thought that the world is a teleology in which the less rational serve the more rational. And since humans are more rational than animals, animals exist to serve humans, and plants, for that matter, exist to serve animals. I don't think that any of us really regard, in Aristotle's sense, the world as a teleology constructed in that way. But it certainly had influence because of its later incorporation into Christian teaching. And it fitted well into Christian teaching because the other root of that Western tradition, coming out of the Hebrew tradition and taken over by Christian teaching, is the idea that human beings were created in the image of God after the creation of the other animals, and that God granted us dominion over them, which by many leading Christian thinkers was regarded as a kind of license to do what we want with animals. That's quite explicit in, for example, the writings of Augustine, who actually explains the puzzle why, when Jesus took the devils, did he put them into the Gadarene swine and let them drown themselves? Or they drowned themselves, ran down the hill and drowned themselves in the sea. Why would he do such a thing? Well, Augustine explicitly said, to demonstrate to us that we have no duties to animals. And that's in keeping with his interpretation of man's dominion. And so that was an important viewpoint. It's worth pointing out that it's something that Christians today are resisting and trying to reshape. In fact, only today in the New York Times you can find an article, I haven't actually seen it in the paper, so I don't know if it was in the physical paper this morning or will be tomorrow, a paper about some new Christian thinking that talks about the work of Charlie Camosi, a Catholic professor of Christian ethics at Fordham University, and the author of a recent book called For Love of Animals, and David Clough, an Anglican who's writing a 2-volume work trying to reshape Christian attitudes to animals. So there's important work going on in trying to say, no, dominion does not mean we can do as we like with the animals. It means that we are entrusted with God's creation to look after them well. And I certainly, if you are a Christian, I certainly would encourage you to support and strengthen that reinterpretation because it's important. But historically, we have to acknowledge that the much harsher dominion teaching has been influential and has been a force shaping those speciesist attitudes, particularly in the Western tradition. Which is not to say, unfortunately, that other lines of thought, Eastern thinking, whether Buddhist or Hindu, has really been free of speciesism. Sadly, it hasn't, although the ideals that you read about there seem to be less speciesist. You look at Buddha's teachings, for example, compassion for all sentient beings seems to be a primary principle. But which Buddhist countries are completely vegetarian? There aren't any. So it's a way in which, I guess, our attitudes, our desires, our habits corrupt religious teachings, even when the religious teachings seem to start off on a much better footing than do those of the Western tradition. So that's another way of defending speciesism, which I think we can reject in various grounds. Either we can simply reject the authority of the scriptures and that account of humans having been given dominion and reject that account of creation. Or if we are within that tradition, we can argue against that interpretation of it and reject speciesism in that way.